by the end of 1963, he actually felt like, he'd been somewhat manipulated and constrained by the name he created within the folk and protesting activist name for himself. So in 1965, or by 1965, he'd released his first album with electrical instruments, and this included the song Mr. Tambourine Man, which is another one of his massive hits. And so that, at the time, electrical instruments, and even now, I'm sure, I'm not too heavily engrossed in the folk industry, but I think it's pretty frowned upon to be playing electrical instruments in folk. So,
yeah.
So he actually he'd headlined it in 1963 and 1964, I think, at the Newport Folk Festival, right? And so he'd gained, this is during his really big growth and, this upsurge in following. And 1965, he decided it was a good idea to mix in the electric. So he performed at a full electric performance at that festival, and I think he only played 3 songs. And then there was all this booing. There was some cheering. It was a
right.
real, melting pot of perspectives.
It was a controversial thing to do.
Yeah.
Right.
There's different perspectives on what really happened, and, was he booed off stage, or did they just not have enough time? But, I think the crux of it is, I think the booing probably he just would have said, don't worry about it. I'll move on. So, Like a Rolling Stone was produced, I think, in the same year, which has been regarded as the greatest song of all time on many occasions, that's a pretty big accolade.
There's been a few songs. That is not a bad effort. It really started almost a movement, that song, right?
Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
I know the Rolling Stones and the Rolling Stone magazine rave about it endlessly. And I think, as I said, quite often appears in their own top lists of, greatest songs ever made. It just must have had just a monumental shift on the way music was, perceived for that time.
Mm.
As well as the lyrical nature of it. But, I'm definitely no music critique.
No.
But so basically, because of this big move to introduce electrical, facing tough crowds and heckling and became part of the touring ritual. And so he even after being in collaborations with the likes of the band, there was still all this booing, and the band was a more electric kind of rock focused type band, and even those guys were getting the boos and heckling. So he did get married shortly after to Sarah Lowndes, and 1966 he toured Australia and the EU, and did basically half and half. So electric and acoustic. Again, tons of heckling, tons of confrontation, and massive drug problem just to go with it all, which was to getting through the tour. Now this was really interesting because he had a bad motorcycle accident, and it's very unclear as to how bad that motorcycle accident actually was. He said, he broke a few vertebrae, but apparently he never went to hospital. And
okay.
Anyway, there was all this suspicion that it was just an exit strategy. And so I think he goes on in his own autobiography that it was a chance for him just to get out of the rat race, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, he sounds like he had the weight of the world on him at that point. I mean, even for someone as free-spirited as him, it must be hard to go that against the grain.
Well, Well, against the grain, imagine the schedules too. I imagine the management of it all certainly wasn't up there with what it is today. Probably less regard for looking after the body, although I'm not sure how much that's actually progressed either.
Not in rock and roll. Well, and it sounds like it's interesting because after that, this tour that he did, the Rolling Thunder Revue, was quite the opposite of a heavily managed stadium tour, you know.